Good evening, this is Harvey Ambrose, and I'm a guest minister on the Wells of Salvation Radio Ministry, preaching tonight to Grace Baptist Mission in Soldotna, Alaska. Continuing our study of the book of Daniel, we are in chapter 11, and I think we ended last week with verse 14, but I'm going to back up to verse 13 and begin our reading for tonight. For the king of the north shall return, and shall set forth a multitude greater than the former, and shall certainly come after certain years with a great army and with much riches. And in those times there shall many stand up against the king of the south. Also the robbers of thy people shall exalt themselves to establish the vision, but they shall fall. So the king of the north shall come and cast up a mount, and take the most fenced cities, and the arms of the south shall not withstand, neither his chosen people, neither shall there be any strength to withstand. But he that cometh against him shall do according to his own will, and none shall stand before him. And he shall stand in the glorious land, which by his hand shall be consumed. He shall also set his face to enter with the strength of his whole kingdom, and upright ones with him. Thus shall he do. And he shall give him the daughter of women, corrupting her, but she shall not stand on his side, neither before him. After this shall he turn his face unto the isles, and shall take many, but a prince for his own behalf shall cause the reproach offered by him to cease. Without his own reproach he shall cause it to turn upon him. Then he shall turn his face toward the ford of his own land, but he shall stumble and fall, and not be found. Then shall stand in his estate a raiser of taxes in the glory of the kingdom, but within a few days he shall be destroyed, neither in anger nor in battle. And in his estate shall stand up a vile person, to whom they shall not give the honor of the kingdom. But he shall come in peaceably, and obtain the kingdom by flatteries. And with the arms of a flood, shall they be overthrown from before him, and shall be broken, yea, also the prince of the covenant. And I'm going to stop reading there at verse 22. And I'm going to reiterate what I've told you guys all along. Chapter 11 is hard. Chapter 11, when you couple it with chapter 12, and they do seem to be connected by the very language, one flows straight into the other, with the ands, and this and that and the other, as though those were one thing right after the next, a sequence, becomes extraordinarily difficult to come up with what they're talking about here. Now, generally what they're talking about is what this whole book has been talking about. They're talking about, throughout the book of Daniel, it's talking about 5 kingdoms. 4 are kingdoms of men, or we should say world empires, and because they're more than just kingdoms, they're the people that are over them are kings of kings. They're kings over other kings. They're empires. They are the Babylonian, which Daniel was in at the time of the first prophecy, even though there had been 2 world kingdoms prior to then, which had been Egypt and Assyria. But starting with Babylon, Daniel has Babylon, and then the Medo-Persian, followed by the Greeks, or the Greek Empire, followed by Rome. And in the days of Rome, in that empire, the God of heaven shall set up a kingdom on the earth through his son, Jesus Christ, who came in the flesh and set up a kingdom while he was here, was crucified, ascended to heaven, and will one day come back and judge this world. And then consummate the kingdom fully by the resurrection of the sainted dead. But it's in a new world. Everything's going to be wonderful. But we don't get that far in Daniel. Not to the, well, actually it kind of does. It may mention the resurrection at the last day, but it definitely mentions a resurrection in the book of Daniel. The question is, what exactly is it talking about? Well, I had intended to tell you that because so many people have understood it this way, that from where we started tonight, this discussion, which had been between two of the successors to Alexander the Great, ruling, on different sides of the land of Israel, the Ptolemies in Egypt, in that part of North Africa, and then the Seleucid empires under the Antiochus types. And that was the biggest of the four empires that rose out of Alexander's empire. Them fighting each other with the only connection between them being the Holy Land. And so their wars back and forth continuously for hundreds of years. I mean, this goes on a long time. Certainly has an impact on Israel, and therefore is something that Daniel is highly interested in. It's just like if you were hearing what's going to happen to Alaska. British Columbia is going to go to war with Siberia, right? And we're right in the middle. So it's kind of like you'd be interested in hearing what's going to happen, and the Lord's telling them what's going to happen. But it's more than that, because it's talking about world kingdoms. So it's happening in those kingdoms. It's happening to the Jews, but it's also happening to the rest of the world because it's world kingdoms. And so when it gets to Rome and then the kingdom of heaven comes, certainly then it applies to all people everywhere, because we read in the book of Daniel, we have read that kingdom will destroy, ultimately, all the kingdoms of the world will go to nothing. They'll all fail. God raised them up in the first place to accomplish His will, but ultimately they all tumble, and only the one kingdom survives, and that's the kingdom set up by the Lord. It's an everlasting kingdom. The king is everlasting. He will never be replaced. There's not going to be a successor to Jesus. He's it, and we'll be glad with that, because He'll be the best of all rulers. And He's good. We'll read that in the song. For the Lord is good. His mercy is everlasting, and His truth endureth forever. And don't you wish that we could say that about all of our leaders? They're good. Man, I don't think we can say that about any of them. They're not, none of them are good. Neither are we. So, typically, where we are right now in chapter 11 is talking about the continuing, what people say, it's going to talk about the continuing battles between the Ptolemaic and the Seleucid kingdom, working their way down to Antiochus Epiphanes, the son of Antiochus the Great, who had made the furthest reaches for a while of that Seleucid empire, grown it as much as it's ever been, and just how rotten of a person Antiochus was. He was, however, mentioned already and talked extensively about in chapter 8. And so it would not be typical of Daniel to basically keep talking about this same guy over and over and over again and ignore the fourth kingdom of man. In other words, ignore Rome, and also the kingdom of our Lord, which comes during the time of Rome. You see what I'm saying? So it's like, it doesn't really fit. It doesn't make sense to end this whole book, because if 11 doesn't get to the Roman Empire and the kingdom of heaven, then 12 doesn't either, because it's just a little tag on the end of 11 that gives some timing. That's all it does. So what happened to the fourth kingdom of the statue or of the beasts or whatever that are portrayed, that are also portrayed in similar ways in Revelation, so that these two prophecies marry up? To the careful reader, you understand that the book is all about the same thing. The prophecies are all aligning with each other. It's not all different. It's just said different and revealed differently at different times. Well, I'm not going to talk about Antiochus. I have been trying to force a square peg into a round hole. Antiochus does not fit here. Antiochus Epiphanes. He's already been discussed in chapter 8. And now he is part of what I began to read at, because he's one of the kings of Persia, of the Seleucid Empire, that this reading began with. But I believe it quickly changes from that to Rome in what I just read to you. So I'm going to start where we started tonight. The king of the north. What that's going to mean, as I said last time, there are lots of kings of the north. You know, it's in this case, we're talking about national Israel. So whatever is to the north of national Israel will be the king of the north. And whatever is to the south of national Israel, or I should say Judea, which is Egypt and, North Africa, Ethiopia, that is the king of the south. Well, kings are born and kings die all the time. It's whoever happens to be ruling. It's not really the king. It's whoever is king of the north will do this and that. And it changes just like men's lives come and go. Some of these people didn't last 2 months. Some of them reigned for 40 years. But whatever they are, they've got an appointment with death just like the rest of us, and they're not as long as this prophecy is. So, the king of the north, I cannot tell you for sure who it is, but I think it is still talking about Antiochus the Great, which will be the third, whose son was Antiochus Epiphanes. But he died around the time that verse 13 is taking place, where it says, the king of the north shall return and shall set forth a multitude greater. So in other words, he had been defeated by the Ptolemies, but now he's got a bigger army and he's coming back again, and all of a sudden the Seleucid interests are going to prevail over the region for a long period of time. Because even though Antiochus the Great dies, his son Antiochus Epiphanes picks up where he left off and is very cruel and does a lot of bad things and becomes essentially the first of the antichrists that the Bible talks about. He is one of the ones that sets up he profanes the temple at Jerusalem. He sacrificed a pig on the altar. He put up a statue of Zeus and said it was a statue of himself. He worshipped his own self. I mean, Antiochus was not good. He forbade the circumcising of male children in Hebrew just because he didn't like them. And he did a lot of things. But that's been already covered in chapter 8. So he does this here in 11. He's obliquely mentioned as just one of the kings of the north. So it says, and those times there shall many stand up against the king of the south. So meaning going against the Ptolemaic kingdom. Also the robbers of thine own people, talking about the Jews, that some of the people in Judea align themselves with the Seleucid kings in their attack upon Egypt. Okay. Trying to establish the vision, trying to make this prophecy come to pass, they thought. It says, but it's going to fall. They're not going to make it. So then we get to 15. So the king of the north shall come, meaning this Seleucid kingdom. He's getting more and more powerful with each successive king. Shall come and cast up a mount and make most fenced cities, and the arms of the south shall not withstand, neither his chosen people. In other words, those Jews that had aligned, at one time against the north, well, they're no longer there. Neither shall there be any strength to withstand. But now in verse 16, see, so this has gone on now between Antiochus the third to Antiochus the fourth, Epiphanes, his son, and then his grandson, who is Mithridates. Okay, that's really who's in charge by the time verse 16 comes along. That's who's in charge of the Seleucid kingdom. And in verse 16 we read this, and he that cometh. It doesn't say where he's coming from. It doesn't say the king of the south. It doesn't say the king of the, it don't say anything. It just says he that cometh. So someone's coming. It's a new player in the Game of Thrones here. He that cometh against him, against whoever was king of the north at that time, which would have been Mithridates, well, the one that Rome fought so hard for so long. I don't know if he was the fourth or whatever, but he was a baddie. And it says, but he that cometh against him shall do according to his own will, and none shall stand before him, and he shall stand in the glorious land, meaning in Judea, which by his hand shall be consumed. Okay, now I'm going to turn to my notes, and I'll tell you where we are in history. Pompey the Great. Everybody's heard of Pompey, right? It's going to be easier at this point because we're going to be dealing with Romans and with names we are familiar with. Pompey the Great, or the Pompeius Magnus, right? So, however you want to say it. He came against Syria in 65 BC in the, I think it's the third or the fourth Mithridatic War against Mithridates. He also invaded Judea at that time, which is spoken of as the glorious land, right? He shall stand in the glorious land. So he's going to establish himself in Judea also. And he annexed it into the Roman Republic as a client state in 63 BC. That's who came. So if Pompey has come there and Rome has taken charge of that area, well, then what's happened to the Greek rulers? Their history. They never did anything against Rome in which they succeeded. So we have morphed, if I'm right about who this is, we have morphed from the Seleucid kingdoms and the Greek kingdom to the Roman kingdom, which on the statue is the legs of iron and the feet part iron, part clay. And it's also in the visions of beast. It's the one that is a terrible thing. They can't even describe it as an animal, but it has brass teeth and iron claws. It just scares Daniel to death. Okay, so that's the Roman Empire. Except in this case, it's still the Republic. Pompey the Great was consul. He was a great general. He was also consul in Rome, which is like their president, except it's just a 2-year term. Too bad we don't have that. And he probably as proconsul is down here now, taking territory in the Middle East. And he staunches, or he stops the spreading westward of the Seleucid kingdom. It's about toast at this point. Once Rome has got a foothold there, it's not going to let go. So Pompey the Great came in, I think in verse 16. He's going to do according to his own will, because Rome has become excessively powerful, way more than any other kingdom, even though they're not an empire yet. All the players are there. Julius, who really starts that empire, not officially, but practically speaking, is a contemporary of Pompey, right? They were together. They were part of a triumvirate at one time. Julius Caesar, Pompey the Great, and Crassus formed the first triumvirate. It's just a made-up name, but it means even though there's not supposed to be any rulers, no kings in the Roman Republic, it's a republic, no kings. Well, the three of them ruled together is an unbeatable political force. Well, then Crassus died, and Caesar's daughter was married to Pompey the Great, and she died. Well, now the tie of marriage that had put those two together had been broken, and Pompey and Caesar are starting to fray a little bit in their relationship with one another. You know, Caesar's out there in Germany fighting the Germans, or not really the Germans, I should say. He's in France fighting the Gauls. Pompey is headed the other direction into the east, and he's fighting Mithridates. But ultimately, these two are going to clash because they both want to rule. They sit at the same table, they talk to each other, but they're not friends. And they're not the last ones. They're not any longer. So anyway, Pompey comes in 16, and he does whatever he wants to. And it says he consumes it. It doesn't mean he kills everybody, but he takes money from it. He annexes it, and tribute is due to Rome. They're a client state. Verse 17, he shall also set his face to enter with the strength of his whole kingdom, and upright ones with him. Thus shall he do, and he shall give him the daughter of women, corrupting her, but she shall not stand on his side. Now, without stating it, it's just giving us, not as though it's the persons involved, like I mentioned Pompey because of just the timing, but it's whoever is representing Rome the most powerfully at the time that the Bible's talking about. Shortly after Pompey, Caesar and Pompey come to blows. You know, Caesar comes back from Gaul, and the Senate tries to stop him, and they fail, and they flee, and they fight with Pompey, and Pompey is defeated in battle, and he goes down to Egypt where he's made friends and actually adopted the heirs to the Egyptian throne, Cleopatra and her brother. And but while he's down there, he's executed by a Roman soldier that's living in Egypt. Not on the orders of Caesar, but it worked, because after Caesar won that battle against Pompey, he goes down to Egypt and finds that Pompey has been killed. But while he's there, he falls in love with Cleopatra and has a son with her named Caesarion. I think it's Caesarion. And anyway, when it says, so in other words, corrupting her. Well, I mean, they were unmarried. He just, it was fornication. So she had a child, and he loved her, but he didn't love her enough to make her his wife. He had a wife. He would never have survived taking an Egyptian woman and making her his wife. The Romans would not tolerate that for a half second, and he knew it, even though I don't think she quite understood that until, well, she eventually had to. So at some point, he leaves Egypt and heads west to conquer new places. And Caesar, of course, as we know, on the Ides of March, is murdered. I don't know if I've got a date for it, but he's murdered in the well of the Senate. And, well, I don't know, I'm going to get lost. But who takes his place is his heir, who is an adopted heir, and it is Octavian. Octavian then kind of has a clash. For the first time, Octavian and Mark Antony, Julius Caesar's most able general, fight together against the powers of the Republic that are still trying to exist, but they defeat them. So now you just have Mark Antony, who went to Egypt and married Cleopatra. So Julius Caesar had her first, then Mark Antony, his general. In the meantime, his adopted heir, Octavian, is back at Rome. And those two also sit at the table, and they face to face, and they combine against others, but they don't like each other. There's no love lost there. And eventually, at the Battle of Actium, which was predominantly a naval battle, fought just off the shores of Egypt, Octavian won against superior forces held by Mark Antony. Mark Antony's armies flee. Cleopatra flees with a bunch of, everybody abandons Mark Antony, and he and Cleopatra kill themselves. She eventually comes back, and they commit suicide, and so it all goes to Octavian, who at this point is made to be the first official Roman emperor. And they call him Augustus. Means they've elevated him to the status of God, because the empire had grown so vast and it was so powerful, trampling everything else, that nothing had compared to it in the history of the world. Whether he didn't ask to be made a god, but I think he was told, or maybe it was after his death that he was elevated to that position. But he was called Augustus from then on. And so, when we read 16, we're talking about Pompey the Great. When we read 17, we're talking about Julius Caesar and Cleopatra. And then it says, in verse 18, he, and I think that means Julius, turns his face unto the isles, meaning the Mediterranean Sea and the islands thereof, and shall take many, but a prince for his own behalf. Well, see, that would be Julius's adopted heir, Octavian, for his own behalf shall cause the reproach offered by him to cease. See, people got mad at Julius Caesar because he aspired to be king, but then they took Octavian without any problem as being their master. Without his own reproach he shall turn upon him. Then he shall turn his face towards the fort of his own land, meaning Julius Caesar eventually goes back to Rome, but he shall stumble and fall. It says, and not be found. And so this is where he was killed by the assassination there by the senators. Brutus leading. Now I know I've taken you a long way from the Bible, but bear with me because this is really the only explanation where historical events line up with chapter 11 of this book, and particularly chapter 12. There's no other way to make it fit that I have been able to find thus far. All attempts, again, it's a square peg into a round hole. It's never going to work. I think verse 20 will get you. It'll help get you to believe in this. Then shall stand up in his estate. Okay, whose estate? Well, Augustus's estate. Augustus has now been emperor for some time. He succeeded Julius and became the first official emperor of Rome, was titled Augustus, for the first of any of the Caesars to ever hold that position. And he was beloved by all, ruled a long time, and began what is called the Pax Romana, meaning the peace of Rome, which lasted nearly 200 years. Now see, that's what all human governments want to try to achieve. They want to try to give peace during their reign so that their subjects are productive and happy and they're not dethroned or killed or whatever. But see, the Bible says there is no peace to the wicked. I mean, they may be secure from war. They may be somewhat secure from famine or poverty, depending upon the wealth of the nation. But the only true peace is what is given to the heart of people when they have humbled themselves before God and sought Him out until He has saved their soul, given them new life, and made them at peace with God. So you can see the empires of men trying to imitate that great desire, but they cannot achieve it. There is no peace, the Bible says, to the wicked. And we're all wicked by nature. It's just if we've been saved, we've been given a new nature. And we have a new Lord. We've been taken from the various kingdoms of this world and put into a singular kingdom, the kingdom of our Lord and of His Christ, who reigns forever. So, in his estate, so in Augustus Caesar's estate, meaning the inheritor of his position, in his estate, it's in verse 20. I got to back up. It happens twice. It happens in 21 too. In verse 20, it's in Julius's estate. So the heir to Julius, the adopted heir, Octavian, he becomes emperor in verse 20. And it says, shall come up in his estate a raiser of taxes. A raiser of taxes in the glory of his kingdom. Meaning at the height of the Roman Empire. As great as it ever got in terms of a civilization and a strong empire, it was really downhill from the end of Augustus on. It just slowly trickled away. Kind of like what's going on in our country. It's just kind of year by year it's getting weaker and more corrupt and more messed up. It's the way empires go, unless they fall suddenly. So in Julius' estate, Augustus comes and he's called a raiser of taxes. Does that sound familiar to anybody? Anybody's hand go up? Let's turn to Luke chapter 3. Chapter 2. Luke chapter 2, verse 1. And it came to pass in those days that there went out a decree from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be taxed. Now that's a raiser of taxes, isn't it? I mean, it's never mentioned taxes before, and all of a sudden it says, this guy is a raiser of taxes. It's like, I'm going to tax the entire world. And he did. He set about doing it. That all the world should be taxed. And this taxing was first made when Cyrenius was the governor of Syria. And all went to be taxed, every one to his own city. And Joseph also, meaning Mary's intended or betrothed husband, went up from Galilee, out of the city of Nazareth, into Judea, unto the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and lineage of David, to be taxed with Mary his espoused wife, being great with child. And so it was, that while they were there, the days were accomplished that she should be delivered. So in the days of the last days of the last few years of the reign of Caesar Augustus, which was a long reign, and he raised the taxes, this brought about the circumstance where the Old Testament had prophesied that Christ would be of Bethlehem Ephratah, the house of bread, and he was the bread of heaven that came down from heaven to feed the world, the spiritual food that we need. He is the bread of life. He told the people while he was here. Anyone that eats of this bread, he says, shall live forever. But it's all, Bethlehem just means a house of bread. And so he was born in the house of bread, and he is the bread of life. And he came to be born there because Caesar Augustus, a raiser of taxes, decreed that the whole world should be taxed, and they got to go to be taxed. They got to be going to the place where their family was from. So the Romans would get a better idea of how this Jewish state was organized too. They wanted to know who was who, because things were family things back then. And they understood that family was important, not because they just wanted it to be important, but it was important to people. And so people are going to behave a certain way based upon their familial relationships. So that's what happened in verse 20. The raiser of taxes stood up in Julius's estate. But it says, and within a few days, now of course in prophetic language, that's years, okay, he'll be destroyed. But not in anger, nor in battle. Well, he was probably poisoned by his wife, Lydia. Okay, that's most likely, I think it was her name, Lydia. She was Tiberius's mother, and she wanted him to be on the throne. So maybe it's Livia. Maybe it's Livia. Anyway, so he wasn't killed in battle, but he was destroyed. He was destroyed with, most historians believe he was poisoned. He could have just died of old age. And it says, and his estate, meaning Augustus's estate, now we're in verse 21, shall stand up, or in his estate shall stand up a vile person, to whom they shall not give the honor of the kingdom. In other words, the Roman Empire, he becomes its emperor. But nobody likes Tiberius. And nobody, they kind of despise him. He's a vile person. I had written stuff about this, but he became emperor under suspicious conditions. Octavian had no natural heir, just like Julius had no natural heir. Octavian adopted sons of his first wife and that kind of stuff. But there were 4 in line ahead of Tiberius, and somehow or other, they all died when they were young. I mean, like when they were in their 20s or something, of suspicious, well, see, Livia is still alive. She was thought to be a poisoner of all those men, until there was nothing left but Tiberius. And so Tiberius ascended to the throne, if you will, of the Roman Empire, a vile person. Now, he's a great general. In Tiberius's time, he extended Rome, just about to the limits. There were maybe a few places taken later, but in his conquest, it's not like they cost Rome money, they made money. The treasury at Rome increased 20 times what it was from the time when he started to the time he died it had grown 20 times, 20-fold above what it was. That's huge. Wouldn't that be great if we could just suddenly do that? Get rid of all this debt that our young people are getting because we're just blowing money? Well, I guess Tiberius was good for something. And but the problem is, even though he was a great general and tactician, he was an evil man. He was really debauched. He was unpleasant. Nobody liked him. He was just vile. For whatever reason, he was hated by his own subjects, even though he did not mistreat them. He was just kind of gross. And it says in verse, and he obtains the kingdom by flatteries. Flatteries is a term that's not really used elsewhere to describe this. It's more like by intrigues. And I think the intrigues, where it's translated most times, it's called he takes the kingdom by intrigues, means basically by his mother having poisoned the opposition. And so it says also, and with the arms of a flood shall they be overthrown before him. So meaning the kingdoms before him will be, because he's a great general, they're broken. But now get this, in the last sentence, the last clause of the last sentence of verse 22, yea, in other words, with the arms of a flood shall they, meaning all these countries that he's conquering, be overflown before him, and shall be broken, yea, also the prince of the covenant. Who is the prince of the covenant? Who is the prince of the new covenant? Who issued in to this world the old covenant brought down on Sinai by Moses, right? Written by the finger of God in tables of stone. The new covenant, it says, I'm going to write it on your heart and in your mind so that you may do it. And I will be to you a God, and you'll be to me a people. And you shall not say one to the other, know the Lord, for they shall all know me, it says, from the least unto the greatest. So that everyone that is under the new covenant has a personal, intimate knowledge of God himself. He's their God, they're his people, they all know him, and they know him by direct contact. They have met the Lord in an experience of grace and been saved. So the prince of the covenant, well, he also was broken under Tiberius. So the Lord was crucified during the reign of Tiberius, and in a sense under his orders. Now, Tiberius did not order Christ to be crucified, but Tiberius placed Pontius Pilate as governor of Judea to execute his will in that area. So in other words, he was just, Pontius Pilate was just put there by Tiberius to rule Judea and rule it right and rule it according to law. And the law said if a man is innocent, he's not to be punished. But Pilate declared him innocent and punished him anyway. I mean, think about that. So even the prince of the covenant, even Christ, was part of this overthrow of nations that was brought about during the reign of the vile person Tiberius Caesar. See, it really does start to meld with true history when you understand there's nothing easy about these words, this wording here. It's not like we're just looking at a picture. You know, we don't know these people, and it talks about corruption and that and the other, and it's, vile people. But when you know the history, you can see that it fits into a morphing from the Seleucid kingdom to the Roman Republic to the Roman Empire, during which days the Messiah came and was cut off halfway through the 7-week period of the last week of the 70 weeks of the prophecy. For 3.5 years, he what does it say? He confirmed the covenant, the prince of the covenant. He confirmed the covenant with many, but he's cut off in the midst of the weeks. But his apostles continued to confirm the covenant with many until the persecution of Saul of Tarsus. Saul was persecuting him, so the people left, leaving only some of the apostles, and the rest of there were Jews that were not going to be converted. So that's the end of the 70th week, even though this chapter is not constrained by the 70th week. It's fulfilled during this, but this is talking about things future from that. So remember, this is Jesus revealing this to Daniel. The very things that we're reading here, they are the words of the Lord himself in the vision that Daniel had of Jesus. That's who's doing the talking here when it says, then shall stand up in his estate a raiser of taxes. That's Jesus telling Daniel about the emperor that's going to be responsible for him being born in Bethlehem of Judea. He said, because the Lord, even though he had not yet been made flesh, he had not been born of the Virgin Mary and entered into this world as Savior, he was yet the Word of God from everlasting to everlasting. He's always been, and he knew exactly what's going to happen because he knows the end from the beginning. And Daniel's wanting to know what's going to happen. He said, here's what's going to happen. This one, then this one, then this one, then this one. Oh, and by the way, I'm going to be born during this time. Oh, and by the way, I'm going to die at this time. Now, he's not saying it that way, but he says it. Even the prince, yea, also the prince of the covenant. That's interesting. We go on, and it says in verse 23, and I think this one is kind of like it's like a backflash. You know, in movies, it'll go back in time a little bit and show something earlier, because I don't understand how it could be anything else. And whether it's talking about Pompey or Caesar Augustus or Julius Caesar, it goes back and it says, and after the league made with him, meaning with Rome. So there was an alliance made at one time between Judea and Rome. Let's see if I can find that in my notes. Yeah. Flashing back. Now see, we're already up to the Lord being crucified here, which would have been 30 or 31 AD. But now we're jumping back to 161 BC, where what does it call it? A league. So the Roman Republic made a league with the Maccabees in Judea, a political party there, the Maccabees. That's where the book of Maccabees comes from. Each party promised to support the other if attacked. So this is like an alliance. It's just like NATO, or whatever. Where, well, if you're attacked, I'll come to your aid. If I'm attacked, you come to mine. That's what that was. Each party promised to support the other if attacked. Rome broke this treaty in 63 BC when Pompey invaded Judea and made it a Roman province. With very few soldiers involved, he took Judea. Now, we go back to Daniel, then it says, the league was made with him. So after the league made with him shall work deceitfully, for he shall come up and shall become strong with a small number of people, with a small people, with just a few soldiers. And that is what happened. Verse 24, he shall enter peaceably upon the fattest places of the province. And this was how Rome was working. Now Rome was not always that way. During the days of the Republic, they'd go in guns blazing. It was all about conquest. But by the point right before it morphed into an empire, they had learned that money was a lot more fun than bloodshed. And so they had learned to get in and to corrupt officials in the local places with bribes and all that, and get power that way. And that is what happened here. And I think we'll get to it. It says, enter peaceably in the fattest of the province. So it says, and he shall do that which his fathers had not done, meaning predecessors of Rome. They if they wanted someplace, they took it honest. They took it by killing. But here it's kind of by flatteries and deceits and bribes. Nor his fathers' fathers. And he shall scatter among them the prey, the spoil, and the riches. In other words, as he goes in, subduing nations peaceably, he's doing it by bribes, by the booty of all this money that Rome has pulled into its coffers, That's how it's done. And he shall forecast his devices against strongholds, even for a time. When it says even for a time, that has a specific meaning. And see if I can think where that would be. It's going to be a single year, but it's a year in prophecy. That's 360 days. By the way, that is what happened. It was 360 days from the time that league was broken until 360 years until Rome fell the first time. It wasn't because it fell to the Vandals at that time. It's because they removed the Roman Empire's capital from Rome to Constantinople when Constantine decided he wanted to live there. So that's from the time that Pompey annexed Judea into the Roman Republic until the time that Rome was no longer the capital of the empire was one time, 360 years. Jewish calendar is 360 years, or 360 days per year, and those days translate to years. And it says, enter peaceably, scatter the prey, he gives them all this money. Verse 25, and he shall stir up his power and his courage against the king of the south with a great army. This is still talking about how Pompey got to where he was. So it's flashing back. And he did. He went down and kind of took over Egypt, over the Ptolemaic kingdom. And what he did, I don't know if I can find it right now. He adopted Ptolemy's son and daughter, which was Cleopatra and her brother, and I can't remember what his name was. Ptolemy the 12th, I think. But he adopted them because they were underage. But then he gets defeated by Caesar, and Caesar, having vanquished him, inherits all things owing to him. That's how things worked back then. So, in other words, this guardianship of these two would-be rulers of Egypt suddenly falls to Julius Caesar. But by this time, Cleopatra's grown enough to where he falls in love with her and has a child with her. And then she eventually marries Mark Antony. So this is going back a little bit and telling about that. It says, yea, they that feed the portion of his meat shall destroy him, and his army shall overflow, and many shall fall down slain. And I think this has gotten to where it's talking about between Mark Antony and, because it's whoever's the leading power in Rome at the time, and Octavian, who became Augustus. Both these kings' hearts shall be to do mischief, and they shall speak lies at one table as though they're getting along, but it shall not prosper. For yet the end shall be at a time appointed. So what he's saying is, no matter what they try to do, God has already determined how long Rome will last as a political power. Now, the Roman Empire continues in Constantinople, but the city eventually falls. It is retaken. So anyway, we've gone as far as I'm going to go, because you guys are going to die if I keep this up. Sorry for the drudgery of it, but if you'll bear with me to the end, I think we can find a way where this actually explains world history as we know it to have happened. And if that's true, it can potentially lead us to events yet in our future, with some concept at least of a time frame for that. Because it does, if understood as I understand, if I'm right about this, the prophecies take us up at the very least until 1798 AD, so recent history by comparison, at which point a cataclysmic change happens, and then it kind of really doesn't go much beyond that other than it's getting close to the end. Well, it's already been about 200 and something years since then, so Anyway, I'm going to end it at that.